So here we are with two basic goals in mind right now. The first of which is to derive some important themes from today's presentations and talk about those. And secondly, we very much would like to take then what we've talked about today and try to place it in also a contemporary reference frame in terms of what happened in 1942 still has resonance with what we're dealing with today. So I've picked out a number of examples of each one of these categories, and my colleagues, I'm sure, will expand on them, or perhaps they'll disagree, or perhaps assassinations may be in order. I don't know. So on the major themes, I thought the one that we've really hit, and the one I speak for everyone here, the one we'd really like you to take away is to understand how contingent the war seemed in 1942. That it was not, now that we're in, we're going to win. That for certainly at least the first half of 1942, it looked like a rolling disaster from which no one, as Richard Overy pointed out, no rational person in April 45 would have been able to predict the end of the war, knowing what they knew at that point. So that, I think, is, if I were going to emphasize one major takeaway from what we learned today about 1942, that would be the biggest one. The second one, I think, we tried to bring home, even though we're talking primarily in the context of the Pacific War, although with John's brilliant introduction, you saw how it was fitted into the overall war. Again, the war is global. What's going on in the Pacific is very much tied in many ways to what happens in Europe and the Mediterranean theater. Let me just toss in one little tidbit that follows this line. One of the most interesting things to me when I was working on my current book, when the Japanese were swinging down, took Singapore, and directly threatening Australia, the Australians naturally wanted to bring home their key divisions. There were 3 of them in the Middle East. And the British didn't want them to go. And Franklin Roosevelt stepped in because both the Australian government and the New Zealand government was very concerned about the situation in the spring of 1942. And Franklin Roosevelt brokered a deal. And he said, we will send 2 American divisions to Australia, the 1st Marine Division to New Zealand, and there was one other Army division to come, 4 divisions. In exchange for this, the New Zealand government agreed to leave their 2nd Infantry Division in the Middle East. They are, in some accounts, the best infantry division in the Commonwealth Forces, or whatever here. And the Australians agreed to leave at least one of their divisions, the 9th Division, in the Middle East through what proved to be the Battle of El Alamein. And those 2 divisions played a critical part in the victory at El Alamein. And so those divisions that we sent to the Pacific in 1942 were not just about holding Australia and New Zealand, they were also part of a brokered deal that covered what happened in the Middle East in the latter part of that year. So the other thing I would emphasize is that when you put together Midway, Guadalcanal, and what happened on New Guinea, one of the things that they did by securing victories there is essentially they secured the political viability overall of the Germany First principle. Had we been losing, certainly at Midway and then potentially Hawaii, then maintaining Germany first probably would have been politically infeasible, at least in the level to which we eventually did that. Now, the other point that we touch upon with respect especially to Kate's presentation is, in 1942, we're not fighting with enormous superiority in materiel or whatever here. We're still mobilizing. And her story about women pilots is a very critical part of that story. They were not making an enormous contribution to the war, but they made an enormous contribution to the future path and role of women in America. And so that was a very significant tie-in, not only to 1942, but to today. And finally, I would say individuals made a difference. You had Joe Rochford, you had Bruce McCandless and Robert Eichelberger, and without those 3 individuals, we don't know exactly how Midway, how Guadalcanal, and maybe how Bunagona would have gone in 1942. Now, in terms of contemporary relevance, it's close to evidence, which always trips me up or whatever here. If you look at the way world looked in the early part of 1942, you talk about dark periods in American history. I mean, this was the potential for the Axis powers to win and bring on a darkness, that Churchill talked so elegantly about. And that's something to bear in mind. No matter how dark things are looking, we can go back if we know some history and usually find things where, there are parallel periods in terms of, serious threats to America. Leadership counts. And I think Craig finishes off extremely well in explaining all the elements that made Chester Nimitz an extremely effective leader. And they're not necessarily out of any current 7 useful habits of admirals or whatever here. There's a certain level of what ultimately I would call character. Character was one of the things that Chester Nimitz possessed to the nth degree. He was always thinking about advancing the mission, about managing his people. He was not thinking about Chester Nimitz. I don't believe he made any decision in the war that was related to his belief about his personal advancement or whatever here. There was a wonderful quote I found just in my research this week by an officer who served as a staff officer at SIMPAC, who remarked that Nimitz, when giving him a direction, would always say, "Will you please?" And he said, 30 years of giving orders had not driven humanity out of Chester Nimitz. And the other thing to finish on is never count out ordinary Americans. I mean, in my view, as I talked about, Guadalcanal was really sort of the test of the whole generation that was going to fight the war. They were facing 2 nation states who claimed that they had the greatest warriors of that era or any era. And those Americans who had to fight those battles in 42, and particularly in the latter part of 42, that was the test. And this was captured at the time. If you read contemporary accounts and also the wonderful history of the 1st Marine Division, this is one of the first things they talk about in that book, is that Guadalcanal was this big test for the entire generation. So with that, I'll turn it open to questions.
I've been attending symposiums since 1995, and this is one of the best. So, question. Dr. Symonds made the statement, it's what people do at critical moments of history. And you just talked about the attempted link up, or the anticipated link up between the Japanese and the Germans. And the thing that I had to think is, thank God for the hubris of Adolf Hitler, who thought that he could lead the German army better than the German general staff, because I don't know what would have happened if he'd left the professionals in line there. So I think that ties into what you said, Dr. Frank, about individuals make a difference. If this is a global war, could anybody talk to the idea of, in the European theater, in the East, how close were the Soviets to economic collapse before they were able to revive around Stalingrad?
John, I think that's your question.
That pretty much comes to me, doesn't it? It's interesting. I don't think there's any way to quantify a point of economic collapse. How do we say, when we've reached that point, or what is the catalyst moment that kicks us over the edge? So, as I said in my presentation, it seems undeniable that we were close to that, but nobody knows how close. And it's funny, too, when I was sending out my Eastern Front portion of my manuscript recently, I sent it to Jonathan House, I sent it to, I think that David Stahel has seen some portions of it too, but I also have a Russian friend who is now a naturalized U.S. citizen. He lives in New York City. When I sent him that portion of the manuscript and talked about the fact that it looked very much like the USSR was on the brink of collapse, he went apoplectic. Was no question of collapse, could not happen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I do think that there's a portion of that really gets to a core element of how the Soviets saw that war, how the Russians internalized that war, and to in any way question that they could not have come out of that conflict on top just does a complete disfunct for them. They can't accept it. So, answer your question, I don't know that we'll ever be able to answer the question, but I am darn sure that they were close to it.
Can I follow?
Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up on that. That's very intriguing. I, too, have a Russian friend, as it turns out. I have a very good friend who's a colleague who taught Russian history at the Naval Academy for 30 years.
Well, Craig, you never told me you had friends.
I have one less now. But she gets apoplectic when I suggest that Lend-Lease was a critical element of the Soviet ability to survive that first winter. She's, no, they could have done it. They didn't need us. That was icing on the cake, but not essential. I'm asking you, what do you think?
Rich and I have talked about this question on a number of occasions. I think it is undeniable that Lend-Lease was absolutely crucial to the timing of the ultimate outcome, that there was no way that the Red Army was going to be in Berlin in April of 1945 without those trucks and the other raw materials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know that that means that the Soviet Union can't win that war, but I'm absolutely certain that without Lend-Lease, they would not have won that war on the timetable that they did.
I agree. This is to Mr. McManus. What became of General Eichelberger after the Buna campaign?
Okay, what became of General Eichelberger after the Buna campaign? The answer is lots. Well, it's quite interesting. He being Eichelberger, he's garrulous, he's friendly, he has a very good rapport with the war correspondents. And he's been given the go-ahead by MacArthur to talk with them. That was one of the enticements that MacArthur had dangled out there for Eichelberger, who really wanted the kind of military immortality that, of course, eludes him now, but went to, like, his classmate George Patton, who, by the way, was a very good friend to his, and I found fascinating correspondence between the two of them. They're very similar. So, yes, he wanted to have that kind of legendary status, and then all of a sudden MacArthur just pulls it back because he realized, I'm not sharing the limelight with anybody. So he threatened to send Eichelberger home if he actually would talk to the press more, and then he took steps behind the scenes to try and make sure that Eichelberger did not quite get rewarded the way he should have for Buna. You know, Rich just mentioned how Guadalcanal is the sort of fire point for this generation. I would argue it's also Buna, too, because, you know, one of the things that's really animating MacArthur to send him there is these tales of how American soldiers have retreated in droves and thrown away their weapons, and many of them are not true. But the 32nd Division shows its mettle to fight in one of the worst battles you could imagine, and kind of all they needed was point in the right direction leadership. So, in the wake of that, Eichelberger is about the next 6 to 9 months training troops in Australia and kind of deeply resenting it. And behind the scenes, it's very possible that they want him in the European theater to command either a corps or what becomes First Army. And he's aware of this, and there's this weird dynamic with MacArthur where MacArthur meets with him personally and says, Bob, I'm not going to hold you back. And behind the scenes, what's he doing? Holding him back. And so Eichelberger kind of discovers this by the end of 1943, and he writes this really fascinating memo for Emma that they put in a safe and everything, because it's just very, very incendiary stuff of all of his resentment against MacArthur that he doesn't want known, of course, but he will still work very well with MacArthur through the whole war, but in the long run, he deeply resents him. So MacArthur brings him back to mastermind the Hollandia landings in April 1944, which he does his usual sort of aggressive job with that, but it's really not as much about combat there as it is building a major base for the advancement of the Philippines. Then after that, when the Biak campaign goes sideways, this is like May, June 1944, he's sent in there again as the fireman to kind of recover the situation, does precisely that, and that's when he gets his Army command, which was already in the offing, but Biak just solidifies that. So Eichelberger then will command 8th Army in the Philippines campaign in 1944 and 45, and then, this is kind of overlooked, he oversees the occupation of Japan through 8th Army. 8th Army had some phenomenal commanders in its existence then. Eichelberger, Walton Walker, who was a fine commander, but most notably Matthew Ridgway in Korea.
I think we have an online question.
All right, this is for you, Katherine. Since the WASP were disbanded in December 1944, who ferried planes for the rest of the war?
Good question. One of the things that the WASP, who were in the ferry command, lamented was the fact that they walked away from bases that had planes sitting piled up. They had a lot of the men pilots. One of the reasons they were disbanded is because men were surviving the war, right? Men pilots were surviving in the war, which we're all happy about. You know, the extended fuel takes on the P-51, the domination over the German and Japanese air forces. Our pilots were surviving, rotating back and coming home. And the reality is they weren't all qualified to step into those planes. And fly those P-51s and P-38s and all those things that needed to be flown. So it just slowed down for a while until they were able to transfer men into those positions, which meant they weren't doing something else. And the one thing that comes up over and over is this was an experiment to see what women could do. The women proved they could do it. But a deciding factor in the whole thing was women were allowed to fly these airplanes because they were releasing men for other duties. And as soon as there were enough men there, it switched very quickly to women cannot replace men for these duties. So as soon as it was perceived that women were taking men's jobs, then they were sent home. Thank you for the question.
I just wanted to add one thing that struck me about this whole thing is anyone who reads about operational flying in World War II, either training or combat, one of the things that we talk about combat losses, but in point of fact, there's stupendous numbers of people who die in aviation accidents, mostly pilot error, sometimes weather, whatever here. And the rates of that are just appalling. And also partially because people push conditions under which people fly but one of the things I was looking at was even that fatality rate, that group, which it's very sad, but actually I was thinking about how many flights those people made. They must have been really good pilots to have such a low fatality rate, just ferrying aircraft.
Yeah, and you know, a good number of those were in training accidents. I've got a list at home of the men who died with the women, whether it was flight instructors or, you know, a couple went down and when they were being moved from place to place. So yeah, not very many of them were actually ferry accidents. They were just different kinds of things. And that's again, one of those comparisons is the women's accident rate and fatality rate compared to men doing the same jobs, right? Not comparing them to combat pilots, but the same jobs, and they did have a better rate. I will say that yes, of course, women are awesome pilots. That's obvious. But part of the reason that they were able to have that better rate is because they were able to choose very qualified women. They, you know, 80% of them had at least 2 years of college when only 4% of American women did. They, you know, they were all very fit. They met the same fitness criteria as men did and more because they had so many women apply that they were able to just take the cream of the crop. So it's not a completely fair comparison, but of course women are great pilots, and thank you for saying so.
This morning we talked, you talked about the successful Japanese foray into the Indian Ocean, and they were very successful, and then they seemed to disappear. One of the comments also was that they did not go after the Lend-Lease supply lines going to the Red Sea. Was part of the reason for that because USSR and Japan had a non-aggression pact at the time?
The issue around the Red Sea in 1942 is that supply line really wasn't set up and operating very much, because what had to happen first is the port facilities in Basra had to be improved, and then the railway network through Persia also had to be improved. And so we were looking at it more in the long term, that we knew that this is going to be an important route, because by the middle of the year, of course, we're aware of the fact that the Murmansk convoys are becoming incredibly dangerous after PQ-17 is destroyed in July. In terms of the Lend-Lease material that's going across the Bering Sea, that's all in Russian bottoms. But there's a determination on our part that we don't want to be putting any high-value combat equipment in those sorts of vessels. So most of what's going in Soviet ships in the Pacific is raw materials and that sort of thing. We're also ferrying aircraft through Alaska. So there's a number of different ways to get all of these things in there, and the Red Sea play is really more of a long-term thing. Back to your original question, though, why did the Japanese disappear after that raid? And I really think that the Indian Ocean raid is kind of an exercise in strategic bankruptcy on their part. They've got this sledgehammer. What are we going to do with it? Let's go hit the British with it. But it didn't fit into any sort of a long-term scheme in terms of overall Japanese strategy. It was a cul-de-sac.
Well, it protected their flank.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the main reason, yeah. Any other? Well, no, I would just add to that the Japanese never intended to stay there in the first place. It wasn't like, let's go here and let's conquer the Indian Ocean. The Bay of Bengal will belong to us. It was a raid, literally a raid, and the idea was to blunt Royal Navy capability so that the Japanese could continue with the solidification of the resource base of the South Pacific, which for them is the primary cause and purpose of the entire war in the first place. So having given the British a bloody nose, having Somerville retreat either all the way over to Madagascar or up to Bombay, they didn't need to worry about their flank anymore, and they could get back to business.
The other thing I'd add on that is that there's still a good book to be written on Operation Sea in the Indian Ocean raid, and it ain't going to be by me, but somebody needs to write it.
All right, this is from Merlin for Craig. Why was there even a South Pacific sub-theater before the Guadalcanal invasion?
When the decision was made that a unified command in the entire Pacific was simply not doable, not just because it's enormous in size, but also because of the problematic circumstances surrounding Douglas MacArthur. You don't want to put Douglas MacArthur in charge of half of the globe. I mean, he certainly thought he deserved it. He never stopped lobbying for it. But when they divided it into the Southwest Pacific area, which of course is Australia, New Guinea, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines, for MacArthur, all the rest, that 65 million square mile area, it just seemed so large, so it was subdivided as well. There was the North Pacific Command, which went originally to Theobald, and then it went to Kincaid, and then so on. But the only operations that took place up there were the Aleutian Islands campaign, so it didn't get a whole lot of press. But the South Pacific area was also a subordinate command. Now, in theory, if you did a wire diagram of this, it would be King to Nimitz, and then Nimitz would have command of the two subordinate areas, the North Pacific and the South Pacific. And that's how Gormley ended up in command of the South Pacific, and then subsequently Halsey in command of the South Pacific, but they both reported to Nimitz. So it's a component part of the overall Pacific Ocean area, which embraced all three of those, Pacific Ocean, North Pacific, South Pacific.
So I would add to that every time I've looked at what happened, how King specifically tells Nimitz there's going to be a separate commander for the South Pacific when King already knows that he's planning an operation in the South Pacific as early as, April of 1942. And I would say that this fits with exactly how much confidence Ernest King had in Chester Nimitz at the time. He's telling him that we're going to have a separate commander for the South Pacific. And then he's going to ride herd pretty closely on that commander.
Yeah, and it's interesting to look at the language here. The original authorization of the divided command is that Nimitz will appoint a commander of the South Pacific. And then the next day, a revised version comes out that says Nimitz will nominate a commander of the South Pacific.
And just as an aside, I wanted to come back to one point. I've been reading the New York Times day by day through the war, which is terrific because it gives you the domestic and the international context. And one thing about Douglas MacArthur that has to be placed in context at the time, if you looked at Allied fortunes in the first 6 months of 1942 in the Pacific, everywhere else, Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma, Java, the Philippines, except for the Philippines, everything was going to hell in a handbasket at high speed. The Philippines seemed to be the only place in this entire theater, this entire region, in which Allied forces were offering determined and effective resistance, had slowed the Japanese down. In fact, from the Japanese standpoint, the commentary on the campaign is that the commander of the 14th Army is retired after the campaign, obviously indicating the belief in Tokyo he had failed. And they come, what's being accomplished by that Philippine-American army is, in the context of the time, seems to be the only bright light in a completely dim and dark environment.
H.B. Wilmot made the comment about that the Americans had not actually done well in the campaign, but they thought they had. And that was important in May 1942.
I've been to 10 or so of these, and I just want to add my compliments to the presenters and the staff for an outstanding conference. My question has to do with MacArthur.
On behalf of all hands, I accept.
Mike, since you're mentioning General MacArthur, my question has to deal with him, because it impacts what happened in the winter and spring of '42. What's the current level of thinking as to what happened to him and his staff in the hours after Pearl Harbor and their inability to act?
There are a lot of people that can riff on that on this stage, but yeah. John, you should start. Come on.
Oh, there's so many ways to go with this. How would I boil it down? The current rate of thinking, nothing good. That would be where we will start. Mystifying could be another aspect of it. MacArthur has it in his mind initially that the Japanese are probably not going to invade the Philippines or really even mess with it. And so he's kind of proceeding on that assumption initially. And so Dick Sutherland was his uniformly hated chief of staff, but I mean, in his defense, he's remarkably hardworking and effective and very bright. But he's just one of these people who is just doesn't seem human at times. So Dick Sutherland is affected by that too. Charles Willoughby, his intelligence officer, and boy, I could go into him on a lot of details. I won't get too deep into, but he has I think failed in some respects to understand something of the Japanese capabilities and threat. I would argue Steve Chamberlain, his operations officer, is probably the finest staff officer that he has. Certainly the most even keel and like normal in terms of personality. So the staff is in something of disarray, and I think also the other thing too is that MacArthur has this Joint Service Command that really is dysfunctional though. So he's not really working very carefully with Lieutenant General Lewis Brereton, another major political and military survivor, who arguably could be the most responsible for the aerial disaster that befalls MacArthur's forces, and yet has a great future ahead of him in major commands in this war. And he's not working very well with Admiral Thomas Hart, who commands the Asiatic Fleet. Now, the dynamic that's in play there is another thing that's unusual about MacArthur. Hart was MacArthur's older brother was a naval officer. And a very up-and-coming guy who died of appendicitis, of all things. What, 1921 was it, Rich? And so, of course, terrible tragedy in MacArthur's family. So Hart was a friend of MacArthur's older brother. So to him, Doug is just his buddy's full of you-know-what little brother. And so it's a weird dynamic. And at one point, Douglas says to him, "Get a real fleet, Tommy, then we'll talk." It's not really the best way to deal with your naval colleagues, in my opinion. So right there, you can see they're not really prepared for the kind of high-speed warfare that they're going to get, just in my view.
One other thing, there's a letter that is at the MacArthur Archive. MacArthur writes to Marshall, I believe it's on the 1st of December. And in that letter, or another letter that's approximate to that time, is that MacArthur's been briefed by his air people, and they told him that planes based at Clark Field or in central Luzon are invulnerable to a bombing attack by Japanese planes based in Formosa, that they're beyond the range of those planes. But the danger is that if the Japanese combine fighters from carriers with bombers from Formosa, that they might be able to do a little more or whatever here, or a carrier attack or whatever here. So he sends that out literally just a week before the war, and that's in the back of his mind that he's been told that his planes in central Luzon are basically safe. I believe the Air Command's failure that morning is spectacular. I mean, the way they screw up is almost beyond belief. But part of it is just happenstance, fortune of war. The first thing that happens is fog closes in over Formosa, but the bases where the Imperial Army planes are not covered by fog. They take off and they bomb northern Luzon in keeping with what MacArthur has been told, because that's as far as they can reach. Then the Americans send aloft the B-17s and other aircraft in response to that. Then after those Japanese planes retreat, the American planes come down to refuel. Meanwhile, the fog has lifted over Formosa. The Imperial Navy strike then takes off and arrives, and here's where the Air Command just fails. We know there's a war on. We get a radar warning of the incoming raid. The control center for the fighters gets word of this. They're supposed to notify the 19th Bomb Group, which has the B-17s, and nobody calls them up or alerts them that there's an incoming raid, so the B-17s are on the ground, which, by the way, they can't be dispersed because there's not enough dry ground around Clark Field to adequately disperse the planes, because we rushed the planes out there before we fixed Clark Field, or whatever here. So this whole cascading series of events leading to this, disaster with the aircraft, and basically you'll read all kinds of accounts that says MacArthur lost all his planes on the ground or most of his planes on the ground. You do the math. He loses 12 B-17s out of the 35 of the Philippines. 16 are down on Mindanao. They're not touched that day. About the same thing, about a third of the fighters are lost or whatever. He loses the radar set, however. That is really critical. And then it trickles down through the end of the month, and American air power in the Philippines is defeated. And MacArthur, once again, he's ultimately responsible, but he's not the guy who makes all the disastrous decisions on that day or other days.
There's at least some evidence, though, that MacArthur was sequestered in his headquarters for 8, 9, 10 hours, and that essentially he's having a nervous breakdown. That there's a total... Yeah, people are trying to get in, they can't get in.
Sutherland won't let them in the door.
That's right. Sutherland is holding the fort down. So...
I speculate on the basis of nothing whatsoever except my dislike of Douglas MacArthur, that he had made public to a number of people his belief that the Japanese would not strike until the spring. He thought there was a good chance the Japanese would go on the offensive, that they might attack the Philippines, but that they wouldn't do it in the winter. They would wait until the spring. He was so convinced of that when he was told they'd attack Pearl Harbor, information that he had long before any of this happened, he just his mind wouldn't accept it. And that, I think, explains this 9-hour sequestration where he was hiding under his desk, and I don't know if he was under his desk, but he was in his office and would not speak to anybody. So
we should give our gentleman in the green shirt in the front row his due.
Regarding the Battle of the Coral Sea, can you tell me why the Japanese only committed 2 of their fleet carriers to that?
Well, there's all sorts of stuff going on there, isn't there? Yeah, why didn't the Japanese bring all of their fleet carriers? First of all, Kido Butai has just done its thing in the April raid in the Indian Ocean, and those carriers are on their way back to Japan when they get word of the Doolittle raid too. Some of them are tearing off after the Doolittle raiders. The bottom line, though, as far as I can see, is that they just didn't think that they needed all of them, that this is going to be a subsidiary operation. Carrier Division 5, Shokaku and Zuikaku are the junior horses in the stall, and we're going to send them down there to get a little training. One of the things I make the point about in my book is that this is due to a Japanese problem in understanding that there really were just 2 kinds of operations in the Pacific when it came to carriers. The kind that you send all your carriers to, and the kind that you basically send none to, in my opinion. So yes, they should have brought more assets down there than they did if they were serious about it, because they understand the mobility of aircraft carriers, right? Which means that the American carriers can be anywhere in the Pacific. So, Craig?
Yeah, I'm going to ask John a question based on this in part. When Hypo first decrypted the initial hints that Port Moresby was going to be a target not just overland but by sea, Kaga came up in some of that message traffic. And then Rochefort told Leighton that it was going to be Kaga and one other carrier, then identified as Ryukaku, later turned out to be the Shoho. Now, Kaga had hit a reef or something. Was Kaga going to be with Cardiv 5? And that would have given him 3 or not?
Yeah, so Kaga grounded herself on a reef. She was not along on the Indian Ocean raid, so they sent her back home to get her bottom patched up. And so initially, yes, Yamamoto says, well, we'll send Kaga down there, and then Admiral Inoue, who was the commander, the local area commander, is like, guys, one carrier is not going to get it done, because there's just been this big raid in early March where the Americans flew carrier aircraft across the Owen Stanleys and smashed our landings off of Leh. So, if, you know, we need to get serious here and send at least a carrier division. Thank you very much.
And that's why...
And that's why they sent a full carrier division eventually.
Question about the attitude of defeatism in Washington during the Guadalcanal campaign. Now, I want to relate it back to my field of expertise out of the American Civil War. Now, we kind of start to see a similar attitude begin to develop in the North around 1864 when we start to see them support the Copperhead Democrats. And then we start to see that also amongst Union soldiers when they start to hear their families write them that they support these Democrats, that there's this harsh response from Union veterans. We ultimately see that they're supportive of the war and that they want to support Lincoln in his efforts. And eventually we see 80% of Union veterans vote for Lincoln in that election. But anyways, my question is, do we see kind of a similar attitude to develop amongst American soldiers at Guadalcanal? When they hear of this attitude, do they kind of resent against the authorities in Washington and ultimately add to their determination in the campaign?
That's about exactly right. I mean, one of the things about the broadcasts, especially those coming out of San Francisco, they can monitor those on Guadalcanal. They can hear these broadcasts, and the reaction to the Marines on Guadalcanal, the place where morale really counts, was, you know, they were almost contemptuous, that people thought they, you know, weren't on top of the situation, couldn't prevail, couldn't hold out. So yeah, there's an interesting parallel. And the other thing too is, I mean, as you point out, I mean, in 1864 we know Lincoln's on record as saying at one point that he thinks he's going to lose the election. You know, it's looking very grim in the summer of 1864. So yeah, you're basically quite correct. And as far as your noble effort to come up with a suitable training program for kids or whatever here on this, my humble offering is one way I've found in doing a teacher training program to get you into like the arsenal of democracy in a very demonstrable, easy way. Tell the story of the development and production of the Jeep. It's a great story. It has real object lessons about how, you know, the Army wrote this typically impossible specification, you know, leap tall buildings in a single bound and weigh only 50 pounds and carry 4 tons or whatever here. And they bring a guy in to do the design, and the company, Bantam company, is so small. When they get the prototype out, there's a picture of the prototype with this group of people. It turns out that's almost all of Bantam Motor Company standing around, and at the back, leaning on the spare tire, is the engineer. And they got the engineer because they called to Knudsen in Washington, who had a Rolodex mind and knew there was this guy who was a great designer who'd been sick that people had forgot about. He said, send him down, and he designed the Jeep in, I don't know, like a day and a half or 2 days or something like that. And the whole production story. I've found, and the teachers have told me, that this is one real great hook because people can connect to the Jeep. You know, maybe not to the B-17 or the B-24, but a Jeep, they can understand a Jeep.
I'm a little reluctant to do a straight line analogy between the Copperhead movement in the North and the American Civil War and the feeling of abandonment that the Marines in the 1st Marine Division may have felt on Guadalcanal, who felt probably a little bit like the defenders of Bataan, abandoned, forgotten, not supported, people, you know, here I am out here, not enough to eat, filthy, dirty, and little appreciated. That was certainly true, I think. And that's one reason why Halsey's appointment to command the theater, Halsey immediately goes to Guadalcanal, shows himself, talks to the Marines, brings some press with him, so they take pictures of him. This is where Halsey was once asked, well, what are your plans now? And he answers, very Halsey-like, kill Japs, kill Japs, kill more Japs. That's his policy. But there was nothing quite like the Copperhead movement. The Copperheads in the North were those who were saying, oh, let the South go, it's not worth the fight. You don't hear that much back, even in those news radio reports from San Francisco. So it's an imperfect analogy, I think.
The other interesting thing to sort of bear in mind is that the nation as a whole had had very little experience or memory with this kind of military adversity. World War I, we get 9 months to amp up and send our troops overseas. There aren't these kind of major losses. No one could have remembered that. The Spanish-American War was a walkover. Certainly both the North and South deal with major adversity in the Civil War, but not as one nation, quite obviously, right? So we've got to go back really to some of the thumpings in the War of 1812 and the White House getting burned and whatever else, and of course the Revolutionary War before that. I mean, no one really remembers that in 1942, and these are peer operators who seem to threaten the security of this country, and Pearl Harbor had shown that. And the West Coast craze and concerned about the possibility of a Japanese invasion and all of this. So I think that the Roosevelt administration felt it was very important to buck up morale. And I've always seen that's where sort of Douglas MacArthur comes into the equation. I mean, Rich makes a good point. The Phil-American force is holding out, whereas everybody else seems to be folding. But part of that seems to be, this cult of personality around MacArthur. It's because of MacArthur's genius that this is happening, and he's our hero, and people are rallying around him, and they're naming post offices after him and all this. Americans need a hero at that point. And I think that it's, we've talked today about how it's really easy to lose sight of the moment. This war could have been lost, and I think even later in 1942, but certainly in 1942. And so I think that maybe that's part of what's feeding some of the mindset as well.
You ready? If I could just address your teaching question real quick. I teach World War II, the American experience in World War II up at Texas Women's University, and then I teach a very ambitious World at War. We had 14 books plus chapters. It's an awesome class. Only the best students take it because it's 14 books. But for my freshmen, I use Willow Run because I like airplanes, first of all, and they're the best. But you get the cool cars. You get the airplanes. I know, a bunch of Navy people, I'm sorry, but the Navy had planes too, right? Right, so you get the cars that they like, you get planes, but you can expand and tell a lot of the story, how the planes were used in the war, but then you can talk about gender and the women doing it, you can talk about labor issues with the strikes that were going on there, the strike busting, and you can talk about race with the race riots, the housing complications, all of those things. So in that one space at Willow Run, you can talk about the whole story. So you didn't ask me that question, but I'm going to tell you anyway.
And thank you both for answering it better than I did yesterday.
You did great.
Let me just, if we're talking about teaching and hooking students, you could do worse than show the first 5 minutes of episode 1 of The World at War. I'm serious. They show that Abadur Saglada, ruined and the marching in and burned down the church, and then the voice, who is it? Laurence Olivier's voice in the background saying, in Asia, in Europe, oh my God, you get through that first 5 minutes and, I'm ready to read 14 books after that. So.
It's a great class if you're in the
I just have a question. Why do you think the Japanese tended to send their forces in so piecemeal and withheld such large forces, like in Manchuria, all the divisions, and even the large surface groups like in Truk and Rabaul that were withheld, like during Guadalcanal? Why was that?
I'll talk first about, I'll let you do the Navy, I'll talk about the Army. For the Imperial Army, the principal enemy was always Russia, the Soviet Union. That was entirely their focus. Bear in mind, as John pointed out, at December 1941, they've got, depends on how you count this stuff, but like 50-some divisions and a bunch of brigades and other things. It's kind of hard to do that in division equivalents. They only cut loose 11 for that whole operation, that massive campaign that gives them one of the great empires in history, 7 time zones. And they do that in 5-6 months or whatever here. And then the Imperial Army wants those units back. They want most of those units back. They don't want to leave them in the Pacific. That's the Navy's job now. That's the Navy's job now. So, and also there's this basic attitude that the Americans are not, first of all, the Americans may not be that formidable, and secondly, we're not going to see them until, in a major operation, until 1943. So that's why they trickle units down to Guadalcanal. And then there's the logistics of it there, which is not a forte of the Imperial Army, about getting people down to the South Pacific. So all those factors sort of combine to this piecemeal commitment that eventually ends in disaster, and also the complex problem of also running on simultaneous operation on New Guinea, which splits them up even more. So, John, tell us about the Imperial Navy's problems.
Yeah, I would echo some of those comments. I really think the fundamental problem with respect to the Guadalcanal campaign for the Imperial Navy is that they have this whole doctrine that is built on the notion of a decisive naval battle, Kantai-Kessen. And I'm sorry, but a down-in-the-mud struggle for a malarial hellhole on a place in the map I cannot even find just does not smell like what I have trained all my life to fight, which is this decisive battle. They can't get their heads around it. It just makes no sense. And so you see time after time where they had opportunities, you know, to come down and absolutely put paid to the airfield. The one example that just continues to blow me away, if you look at the two critical naval battles in November of 1942, first and second Guadalcanal, they could have brought 4 Congo-class battleships down to the party. They could have brought also Mutsu and Yamato, which were up in Truk. Now, I don't know why they didn't do that. I have a suspicion that there may have been fuel constraints that played into that. But again, it just didn't seem like the kind of thing that you wanted to be potentially risking potentially half of your battleships, which were still in their eyes a very important component of the overall battle force, and so they wouldn't push those chips into the ring. And again, it's breathtaking when you look at Halsey's willingness to say, I got 2 fast battleships and 4 destroyers, I'm in, baby. You know, I'm gonna fight you down to the last bloody rowboat if that's what it takes, and he was willing to do that in the confines of Iron Bottom Sound, which, again, for battleship combat is no bigger than a bathtub. You know, I can lob a shell clear across the sound. It's terrifying when you think about taking fast battleships into those waters. Halsey was willing to do it, and they just never were.
That's good. What he said.
I am wondering why that we don't hear very much about the Redmond brothers and what they did to Joseph Rochefort, and also why we don't hear much from about old Stanhope Ring and his flight to nowhere.
Oh, man.
Let me start this off by saying I've had this tick in my mind ever since I first got into this issue. Every time someone says the Redmond brothers, I see this vaudeville act with straw hats and canes dancing across the stage. I just can never get that image out of my mind with these bastards.
We don't remember the Redmond brothers because they were horrible, cynical, bureaucratic operators that needed to be consigned to the ash can of history, and they rightly were. We remember Rochefort because he was the guy that made the difference there. Craig?
What he said. For those who don't know the Redmond brothers, the director of communications, Joseph, was the elder brother. He's an admiral. His younger brother is a captain, John Redmond, and he's the individual Rochefort was to report to in the chain of command. Their notion, and it's not entirely unreasonable, is that they are the center of the intelligence web. They're supposed to get information not just from Rochefort at Hypo, but from Belkanen and from the British and from everybody else, and then it'll all be collated and analyzed in Washington, and then the conclusion would be sent out to the theater commanders, including Nimitz. But what happened in Pearl Harbor is that because Leighton and Rochefort knew each other well, had spent 3 years together in Japan, they short-circuited the system. Rochefort called Leighton on the phone. He didn't call Redmond in Washington. He called Leighton and said, hey, the man with the blue eyes will want to know about this. And the Redmonds felt left out, not unreasonably so. Now, what's interesting is that John Redmond, the younger brother, is sent out to Oahu to become the communications director as one of Nimitz's staff officers. Well, that did not go well early on. But Nimitz, being Nimitz, eventually brought John Redmond around. And John Redmond, by the time the war was over, thought Nimitz was the greatest man he'd ever known in his life. So they may be rotten people, but they were curable. Stanhope Ring is another story. Stanhope Ring, for those who don't know, was the air group commander on board the Hornet underneath Mitcher. We talked about how Mitcher sent his air group off in the wrong direction based on an assumption, again, an intelligence failure of sorts, that 2 of the 4 Japanese carriers were operating 80 to 100 miles behind the first 2. They weren't, so they flew out, nothing there, flew back. Most of them flew back. A lot of them ran out of gas and went into the drink. That was a total disaster. But Stanhope Ring was told to do that, and this is all by, feel free to criticize this. Mitcher told him to do it. It wasn't that Ring was a bad navigator and went the wrong way. Mitcher told him, look, nobody's taking care of those other 2 carriers. You got to go find them and get them. And we know that Ring behaved in accordance with Mitcher's orders, because when Mitcher was booted out of his job and sent to Kaneohe, he brought Stanhope Ring with him as his chief of staff. Never complained that Ring had gone the wrong way. Ring did exactly what he was told to do. Now, Ring is not a likable fellow anyway. The pilots hated him. But it's not that he went the wrong way, it's that Mitcher sent him in the wrong way. There, okay.
Now, the final summary I would give for this is that, when you look at this issue, think of this question. You've got Joe Rochford, who didn't go to college, had no college degree, and you had the Redmond brothers, who are both Annapolis products. Who are you going to believe? That was meant to be a joke, I'm sorry.
This is a question for John. He was asking if you could briefly comment on MacArthur's behavior in regard to consideration being given to an award of a Congressional Medal of Honor to General Eichelberger.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Yeah, so that among the many ways that MacArthur sort of does Eichelberger dirty is the possible awarding of the Medal of Honor, which, as you all know, MacArthur had received, for his, I don't know why he got it, but he got it for what he did in the Philippines, I guess. But so he had gotten the Medal of Honor, and so the trouble, if you're a Corps commander at that point in time, you don't really have that much of a superior to nominate you for a Medal of Honor, someone who would have been right there to see your acts of valor, which is what the medal is supposed to be about. So the nominations came from Eichelberger staffers, who were acting honestly, I will tell you. But still, that's a little bit of a dicey kind of dynamic. So it's going farther up the chain, and it really, George Marshall is inclined to give Eichelberger this Medal of Honor, feeling as though he deserved it, and MacArthur just completely put the scotch on it. And there it stopped, and there it stopped forever. Further, Eichelberger did receive the Distinguished Service Cross for Buna, and it was his second DSC. He'd gotten it for Siberia as well. But so did several other people, who did not see the combat Buna did. I mean, people, high-ranking staffers and whatnot. And the way the citations were written weren't much different. And so Eichelberger really burned about that. So in the final estimation, should Eichelberger have gotten the Medal of Honor? I don't know there's any single act of valor we could look at and say this is extraordinary, although they're all quite courageous. But the totality of it does sort of point you in that direction. And this was something that I think Eichelberger felt very, very resentful of for his entire life. So he's denied you one of the primary Army commands of all time, possibly in the European theater, maybe even Operation Overlord. He's denied you the Medal of Honor. He has sidetracked you to go train troops after you've won the first battle. How are you going to feel about MacArthur if you're Bob Eichelberger? So, yeah, it's a good question.
I would like to ask anyone who'd like to answer. So for us who are parents and grandparents and maybe teachers, what can we tell our students or children of today? What's important to know about World War II in the Pacific as related to things that have happened in the recent past or things that are happening today, such as in Ukraine?
Thanks for that softball.
Right. Should know about what the Army did. Gosh.
And the airplanes.
And the airplanes. There's, you know what, here's a side of the war that I think is just so obscure and really shouldn't be. The experience of American service people in Australia. About 1 million Americans either are stationed in Australia or passed through Australia in the course of the war. And this is, of course, a seminal moment in Australian history with Australia, casting its defense and security lot alongside the United States. But also the socio-cultural part of that, I think, is really the most interesting. And what stands out as much as anything, and this, I just don't think this is very well known in this country, much less Australia, is the White Australia laws that are in place prior to World War II that basically had said, to come into this country, you have to be white. And this butts up against the military realities you're looking at in 1942 that we've been talking about, in which a lot of the U.S. soldiers who are going to be coming into the country are going to be African Americans to build the ports and build the airfields and all that. This butts up against the White Australia policy, and so initially you see MacArthur's command basically arguing for racial integration in the sense of saying, okay, yeah, you're bringing these soldiers in here and you're going to accommodate them, Australia, if you want our help. And that all sounds great until you see what actually happens on the ground. The Australians will tend to treat the African American soldiers better than their white countrymen. And you end up with riots between white and black servicemen, a really tense situation that really kind of calls into question what the whole war is about and where this country is at that point. So if you're talking about aspects of World War II that are so overlooked that grandparent or grandchildren and kids haven't heard about or whatever, I think in a way that's a place to start with a kind of re-examination of the whole war and things that I think are absolutely relevant 80 years later, issues that remain relevant.
I'll chime in on a completely different angle. I've actually been posting a lot of stuff on the Ukraine war on Facebook, and I've been sort of blown away by a lot of my stuff has been being picked up in Ukraine. I've gotten 300 friend requests from people in Ukraine, and I don't know why that is. But one of the things that I find so intriguing is looking through World War II analogs of what's going on in that conflict right now. And one of the things that the USSR gets a really bad rap for in the war, there's this sort of common belief, well, they only won the war because they just threw warm bodies at the problem until they ran out of Germans to kill. And that is so untrue, that actually if you look at what's going on under the hood in the Red Army in that 15-month time period from July to November, there's this tremendous transformation going on in terms of doctrine and weapons mix, et cetera, and that is all being driven by this incredibly clear-eyed, very ruthless but very concisely thought about initiative on the part of Stalin and the Stavka to diagnose the problems in their army and to fix them. And then you compare that to the absolute lack of lucidity on the part of Vladimir Putin and the Russian army's inability to fix any of their problems. And I find that dichotomy absolutely fascinating. And it goes back again to that larger point that there are very few wars that are actually preordained when it comes to the outcome, that morale is also incredibly important, and we see that in the armed forces of Ukraine.
General Haig and I were just talking about that very subject, about the Ukraine, and the point he made, which I fully concur with, morale is based upon the fact that you have confidence in the guy on your right and on your left, you have confidence in your immediate leadership, you have confidence in your higher level in political leadership. The Ukrainians have that, clearly. The Russians, no. There is no level of confidence. And that's a lesson you can talk about from World War II, Guadalcanal or Buna or whatever here. That's simply a critical element without which everything else fails, and the numbers don't make any difference.
And I will just put my oar in the water as well. I think unity and division, along with morale, are important to success in any national undertaking. If you looked at the United States in 1937, 1938, the vast majority of Americans, upwards of 70%, would not have gone to war for anybody, for any reason, didn't trust war. World War I was a mistake. We should never have gone in there. It was for nothing. We're never going to do this again. The divisions are bitter, as bitter, nearly at least, as they are now, between elements of our society. Pearl Harbor ended that. We became a single people. Oh, there were the outliers, of course, by and large, but very few. And that, too, is reflected in, I think, the Russian-Ukrainian war that's going on now. That there is unity on the sides of the Ukrainians because they were the victims of an overt cross-border assault. And the Russians don't have that sense of unity. So that ties with the morale question as well.
I think I agree with everything that's been set up here, and I would just add the importance of logistics and courage, right? And the combination of those, this idea of the Ukrainians, as brave as they are, and as courageous as they are, and as unified as they are, if they didn't have stuff, and that's, you know, the weapons and the food to feed their people, and if they didn't have those things, they wouldn't have lasted as long as they have, and they wouldn't be feeling as optimistic and positive and all that positive press because they're able to push back and they're able to fight. And sometimes that stuff is a tractor towing away a tank, right? But it's that they had the fuel for the tractor. And so I think that combination of the spirit of the people and the courage of the people and the unity of knowing they're right, but then that help of getting the stuff there, whether it's the United States and Lend-Lease in World War II or the world today in Ukraine. So I think it's that combination of people and stuff.
There was a great line on the internet I saw about the Ukrainian government issuing a directive indicating that if you capture a Russian tank, you will not have to report its value for income tax purposes. Listen, we've now had a wonderful day, a tremendous day, I think, and I fully agree that this has been a stellar symposium. And we finished on a very nice medley where every one of our participants got to put their oar in, or motor in, or whatever they've got in, propeller in, whatever here. So thank you all very much for attending it, and on behalf of all of my colleagues, thanks to the museum and the staff for the wonderful job they've done.